When the gold standard ended in 1971, almost nobody noticed, but everything changed. On the evening of August 15th, 1971, millions of Americans were relaxing at home, watching television like any other Sunday night. President Richard Nixon appeared on national television to deliver a short speech. It lasted less than 10 minutes. Most viewers expected another routine political announcement, and at first, that's exactly what it seemed to be. Nixon discussed wage freezes, price controls, and temporary measures to stabilize the American economy. Then, almost casually, he made a statement that would permanently change the world's financial system. The United States would no longer exchange US dollars for gold. To the average citizen, this sentence meant almost nothing. People finished watching television, went to bed, and woke up the next morning to continue their normal lives. They still received their salaries in dollars. They still bought groceries with the same bills. Nothing looked different, yet behind the scenes, one of the most important economic systems in human history had quietly come to an end. Historians later named this event the Nixon Shock. Unlike many historical turning points marked by revolutions or wars, this one happened almost silently. There were no protests in the streets, no dramatic headlines warning that the financial system had fundamentally changed. However, this single announcement would eventually influence inflation, government debt, housing prices, stock markets, wealth inequality, and the role of central banks for decades to come. To understand why Nixon's decision mattered so much, we first need to understand what the gold standard actually was. Money has always served three important purposes. It allows people to exchange goods and services, provides a common unit for measuring prices, and stores value over time. Throughout history, societies used many different forms of money, including shells, salt, silver, and copper. Eventually, gold became the preferred foundation of many monetary systems because it possessed unique characteristics. It was scarce, durable, portable, divisible, and impossible for governments to create at will. Under the classical gold standard, every country's currency represented a fixed amount of gold. In the United States, for example, the dollar was legally defined by a specific quantity of gold. Anyone holding paper dollars could theoretically visit a bank and exchange them for physical gold. This simple rule placed a natural limit on how much money governments could create. If they printed too many dollars, people would quickly exchange those dollars for gold, causing government reserves to disappear. While this system provided long-term price stability, it also had disadvantages. Governments and central banks had very little flexibility during economic crises because they could not freely increase the money supply. Many economists later argued that the Great Depression became even worse because countries remained tied to gold instead of expanding their economies through additional spending. After World War II, world leaders wanted a more stable international financial system. In 1944, representatives from 44 nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new monetary order. Instead of every currency being directly linked to gold, only the US dollar would remain convertible into gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. Other countries would simply peg their currencies to the US dollar. The arrangement worked because the United States held most of the world's gold reserves after the war. Foreign governments trusted the dollar because they believed they could always exchange it for gold whenever they wanted. For nearly 2 decades, the Bretton Woods system supported global trade and economic growth. However, hidden inside the system was a fatal contradiction that Belgian economist Robert Triffin identified during the 1960s. The world needed increasing numbers of US dollars to support expanding international trade. To supply those dollars, however, the United States had to keep running trade deficits and sending more dollars overseas. As more dollars accumulated around the world, the amount of paper money gradually became much larger than the gold reserves backing it. Eventually, if every country demanded gold at the same time, the United States simply would not have enough gold to honor those promises. As the 1960s progressed, the problem became impossible to ignore. The United States was spending enormous amounts of money on the Vietnam War while also funding President Lyndon Johnson's ambitious social programs known as the Great Society. Government spending expanded rapidly. Inflation began to rise and more US dollars entered circulation around the world. Foreign governments started losing confidence in the dollar. France under President Charles de Gaulle became one of the loudest critics of the system. Rather than holding American dollars, France began exchanging large amounts of them for physical gold. Other countries followed the same path. America's gold reserves steadily declined while the number of dollars circulating globally continued to increase. By 1971, President Richard Nixon faced an impossible choice. He could either reduce government spending, raise taxes, and devalue the dollar, or he could end the dollar's convertibility into gold altogether. During a secret meeting at Camp David with Treasury Secretary John Connally and his economic advisors, Nixon chose the second option. On August 15th, 1971, he announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. Although the word temporary was used, the suspension became permanent. The gold window never reopened. This decision marked the beginning of a completely new monetary era. For the first time in modern history, the world's largest economies operated with currencies that were backed by nothing more than confidence. These currencies became known as fiat money. Unlike gold-backed currencies, fiat money has no intrinsic value and cannot be exchanged for a fixed amount of a precious metal. Instead, its value depends on trust in the issuing government, the strength of the economy, and the credibility of the central bank. By 1973, the remaining parts of the Bretton Woods system had collapsed, and most major currencies began floating freely against one another. Exchange rates were now determined by supply and demand rather than fixed agreements. The transition fundamentally changed how governments and central banks managed the economy. One of the first major consequences appeared during the 1970s. Without the discipline imposed by gold reserves, central banks had much greater flexibility to increase the money supply. At the same time, the oil crises of 1973 and 1979 pushed energy prices sharply higher. Together, these events contributed to one of the most difficult economic periods in modern history. Inflation reached double-digit levels in many countries. Economic growth slowed, unemployment increased, and prices continued rising. Economists called this unusual combination stagflation because it combined economic stagnation with high inflation. In the United States, inflation climbed above 10% and, during some years, approached 14%. Ordinary families watched the purchasing power of their savings decline as everyday goods became increasingly expensive. Everything changed again in 1979 when Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve. Determined to restore confidence in the US dollar, Volcker dramatically increased interest rates, pushing them above 20%. The policy caused a severe recession, but it eventually succeeded in bringing inflation under control. Although painful, the Volcker era demonstrated something important. Under a fiat monetary system, central banks, not gold, would now determine how much money entered the economy and how aggressively inflation would be fought. Another long-term consequence of leaving the gold standard was the dramatic expansion of debt. Under a gold-backed system, governments faced natural limits because creating excessive amounts of money would quickly threaten their gold reserves. Once those restrictions disappeared, borrowing became much easier. Public debt, corporate borrowing, and household credit all expanded at unprecedented rates. In 1971, U.S. federal debt stood at roughly 35% of GDP. Over the following decades, that figure climbed above 120%, while total global debt reached several times the size of the world's annual economic output. Supporters argue that this flexibility allowed governments to respond effectively during crises such as the 2008 financial collapse and the COVID-19 pandemic. Critics, however, believe it encouraged excessive borrowing and delayed difficult economic adjustments rather than solving underlying problems. The rise of fiat money did more than change government borrowing. It also transformed financial markets and wealth distribution. Over the decades following 1971, the prices of stocks, real estate, and other financial assets increased much faster than wages. While many factors contributed to this trend, economists often point to monetary policy as one of the most important. When central banks increase the money supply or lower interest rates, the new money does not enter every part of the economy equally. Instead, it often flows first into financial markets. Investors buy stocks, bonds, and real estate, driving prices higher. People who already own these assets become wealthier, while those who rely mainly on wages often struggle to keep up with the rising cost of living. This growing gap has fueled ongoing debates about wealth inequality. Some economists argue that globalization, technology, education, and tax policy are the primary causes. Others believe the shift to fiat money has amplified these trends by encouraging asset inflation. Although there is no universal agreement, many researchers note that the divergence between asset prices and wage growth accelerated after the end of the gold standard. Another major consequence of Nixon's decision was the dramatic rise in the importance of central banks. Before 1971, central banks mainly existed to maintain the convertibility of their currencies into gold. Once that requirement disappeared, their responsibilities expanded enormously. Today, institutions such as the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and the Bank of Japan play a central role in guiding the global economy. These institutions influence borrowing costs by setting interest rates, regulate the supply of money, supervise financial stability, and respond to economic crises. During periods of recession, they may reduce interest rates or inject additional liquidity into the financial system. During periods of high inflation, they typically raise rates in an attempt to slow economic activity and stabilize prices. Following the global financial crisis of 2008, central banks introduced an unprecedented policy known as quantitative easing. QE. Instead of simply lowering interest rates, they created new money electronically and used it to purchase government bonds and other financial assets. The objective was to increase liquidity, encourage lending, and prevent the collapse of the financial system. The same approach was used again during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. Governments around the world introduced massive economic stimulus programs while central banks created trillions of dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to support businesses, financial institutions, and households. These extraordinary measures helped prevent an immediate economic collapse, but they also expanded money supplies at an unprecedented pace. Such large-scale monetary expansion would have been almost impossible under the traditional gold standard because every new unit of currency would have required additional gold reserves. Under the fiat system, however, central banks had the flexibility to respond quickly to emergencies. Supporters argue that these actions saved millions of jobs, prevented financial panic, and allowed economies to recover much faster than they otherwise would have. Critics, however, believe that years of aggressive money creation contributed to higher inflation, record government debt, rising housing prices, and greater wealth inequality. More than 50 years after Nixon's announcement, economists still debate whether abandoning the gold standard was the right decision. Supporters of a return to gold argue that a gold-backed currency would place strict limits on government spending and excessive money printing. They believe this discipline would help preserve purchasing power, reduce inflation, and encourage long-term financial stability. Opponents disagree. They argue that modern economies are simply too large and too complex to function with a fixed supply of gold. They point out that the gold standard reduced government's ability to respond to crises and may have made the Great Depression even worse. They also note that the world's gold reserves are far too limited to support today's enormous global economy. For these reasons, no major country is currently preparing to return to a gold-backed monetary system. Nevertheless, discussions about monetary reform continue whenever inflation rises, financial markets become unstable, or confidence in governments begins to weaken. Looking back, the announcement made on August 15th, 1971 appeared insignificant to most people watching television that evening. Yet history would later recognize it as one of the most important economic turning points of the 20th century. The end of the gold standard permanently changed how money is created, how governments borrow, how central banks operate, and how the global financial system functions. More than 50 years later, debates about inflation, debt, housing prices, wealth inequality, and financial stability can all be traced, at least in part, to that quiet Sunday evening when the United States closed the gold window. The decision lasted only a few minutes on television, but its consequences continue to shape the modern world every single day.